Thank you for joining us. As I said, today's discussion is going to concern hurricane preparedness, how to help your community weather the storm. For today's webinar, my name is Doug Weinstein, Senior Vice President of Operations for AKAM. I'm joined today in our distinguished panel by Jordan Litt, who is the Senior Forensic Roof Specialist with Best Roofing, and Keeley Megarity, who is President of Claremont Property Co. Welcome to our presenters and discussion panel. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for all our participants. If you have a question, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. You can put it into the chat or the Q&A, and I will be monitoring that, and then we will go through them at the end of the session. So basically, as everybody knows, we're less than a month away from the start of hurricane season, which runs June 1 through November 30th. This year's predictions put out by Colorado State University call for 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, 2 of which will be major hurricanes. And then further for landfalls, we are privy to a private forecasting service who has told us that this season we expect 2 to 3 landfalls in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't know yet where they will be, but that's why we're having our seminar today, to be prepared. And we're going to break it down into basically 3 areas. One is pre-storm preparation. The other is what to do during the storm.
No, everyone's.
And the other is post-storm recovery. So to start it off, basically pre-storm preparation. One of the most important things in pre-storm preparation is to work with your managing agent to get your building ready. Would everybody please mute their Zoom call, please? We're getting a little background feedback. Thank you. So in preparing for your community for hurricane season, okay, it starts, people ask me, when does preparation for the next hurricane season start? And I like to say the day after the prior one ended, because that's when you really have to start preparing. So what I'm going to do is turn it over now to Keenan, and basically from your end, can you go through a couple of things that you feel a building or a property should do to prepare?
I'm sorry, did you want me to answer that? Or?
Yeah, if you could go through a couple of your key points.
Absolutely. So I think I think you mentioned it, start preparing, kind of the last day of the previous hurricane season. And we agree with that completely. And I think the insurance companies, especially today, with all of the policies tightening up, the limits tightening up, the deductibles going up, documenting the condition of the property prior to the storm is even more important now than it has been in the years past. And I think one of the best things you can do is to document photos, keep receipts, roof replacements, balcony replacements, any capital improvement projects that have been done, have all that in one spot where knowing that we can produce all that to the adjuster after the storm to prove the property's condition. Helps with is the best thing you can do to prepare for the claim.
And I think one of the things that we've always spoke about in terms of insurance for your condominium association or HOA is to know your coverage. And one of the things that we also recommend, Keeley, as I know you have done this before, is in your clients where you'll set a meeting to appear at a board meeting before hurricane season to explain what the insurance coverage is for the association as opposed to what the coverage is for an individual's unit, which I think is very important for all residents to understand. And also to go through the entire procedure with insurance prior to the season. Because I think one of the things that a building, particularly in the insurance environment we're in, one of the things that it's particularly important for a board to focus on is what your hurricane deductibles are. And that once you have advised what the hurricane deductibles are, how is the association going to fund the deductible? Because they can be quite sizable depending upon the size of the property. And that's where your management company comes in to assist you in basically obtaining alternate financing methods should you need it for those deductibles, such as loans or lines of credit, things such as that. So aside from insurance, the other things that you really need to prepare is have your records available off-site. So in other words, resident list, anything having to do with your insurance coverage, broker information, broker contact names of any contacts you have for emergency vendors. I'd like to go to that point for a moment, which is something I'd like to turn it over to Jordan, because as one of the biggest roofing companies in South Florida, one of the things that they offer their clients is an established hurricane response program and an expedited program. If you could describe that, Jordan, and what it involves that you do with a pre-roof inspection before the season, that would be great.
Absolutely. One of the first things, and I think one of the most imperative, things that you need to take into account is making sure that you do have some type of a relationship with a licensed and insured roofing company prior to the start of hurricane season. It's important to have that information with the property management company, but also make sure that you have it either off-site or off of a phone to make sure that someone can actually access that information and get in touch with us as soon as the storm has passed. But certainly, once the previous hurricane season has occurred, I would highly recommend making sure we're out to the property. We can properly inspect it and provide a comprehensive roof audit of all the issues that we think that should be remedied prior to the start of the next season. And then we could also do the same for you after the storm has come through. We typically take on no new clientele after a storm. We're making sure that we take care of the people that have been working with us, essentially, so we have all the information from access and make sure that we know what's going on site there. And depending on the severity and complexity, we'll either determine a temporary repair or try to make sure that we can actually get it right and fix it right the first time we're actually back on site.
Okay, what are some of the things that you look for when you do your pre-hurricane inspection that managing agents or boards should be aware of? That roof has a lot of different components. It has flashings, it has penetrations and stuff like that. So if you could just give a second to say, what do you look for and what do you find problems that are really affected by hurricanes when it comes to a roofing system?
Sure. So first and foremost, we're probably going to start with looking for any, debris, satellites, anything that's loose, could come loose, become a projectile. We want to make you guys aware of that and make sure, if there's any trees that need to be cut back, things of that nature that could potentially damage the roof. And then on top of that, any drains and scuppers, we want to make sure those are clear of debris. They're properly attached to the building and structure. Because at those locations, typically the lowest point on the roof, that's where all that water will evacuate away from the building. So we want to make sure that those, along with all the flashings and penetrations that you mentioned, are properly secure, that you don't have any areas of delamination, any areas that could potentially lift, because typically the corners and perimeter of the building are the first areas to go during a high wind event.
Okay. Also, let me go back a moment to, again, what the association needs to do as far as preparations as concerns your residents. One of the things that your managing agent will be doing is sending out prior to the season a hurricane guide for your particular association, in which you'll have basic information about the building, what to do in case of a hurricane, like obvious things such as take everything off a balcony or a terrace. Very important if your association has a large amount of snowbirds in your building where you want them to take these things off before they leave for the season, because the hurricane season is basically during times, a lot of it is during times when residents won't be, will be at another home or up in the north or what have you. The other thing that you want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that you have a hard copy of some of your documents off-site as well as on-site. In terms of, if you have a front desk, you'll want to have a manual listing there of your residents. I know during the year you use a resident portal through the computer, but if electricity goes down or there's an internet interruption, you want to be able to have resident information in hard copy available at the front desk. Some of the other things that, you should be doing, aside from what Keeley had mentioned, very important, do a photographic pre-condition, pre-season record of your building, either photographs or videography. And there's other things with physical plant that you need to do. You need to make sure that, number one, your generator is tuned up for the season, that fuel is in stock, whether you use propane, natural gas, diesel. Remember, one of the things that will happen during a hurricane is that supply chain may be interrupted. So you want to top off all tanks before season and get that ready to go should you have a power outage. The other thing that you should also do is, in your resident guide, you should have included what is the hurricane evacuation route, what is different things about a go bag that you should have your residents prepare for themselves, things such as that. Also, what you want to do is your building staff wants to do some prep. As Jordan mentioned, check the areas around your roof, drainage, things like that. But there's other things. There's flood mitigation systems that I get asked about all the time. Some are permanent, some are portable. Just even to have what we call water hogs, which are blow up things that you can put against the opening of a door, let's say to your lobby, or if you have a lower level garage, try and mitigate some of that. Make sure your pumps are working, your ejector pumps are working. Everything physical plant needs to be checked well in advance of June 1st, the start of the season. Because don't forget, it used to be with seasons, and Keeley and Jordan, you remember this, where the seasons used to be, everybody said, oh, well, nothing happens till August and September. Well, the last couple of years have proved that wrong. So what they're actually thinking of doing, what's on the table, is extending the hurricane season to start May 1, because we have had events in May. And in last year, if you remember correctly, we had a couple of events in June. So you have to be ready well in advance of that June 1st deadline for the season now. I want to turn our thoughts now into during the storm.
Sorry,
Okay.
Doug, just one other thing on the
Sure.
preparedness. Some of these smaller cities require a pass to get in right after the storm, and they close off the entrances, they close off access so that owners and looters and all that kind of stuff so prevent looters and only allow owners, but they will give passes out to people who qualify before the storm, because you can't get them normally for several days after the storm, and that's important for staff to be able to get back to their properties.
Excellent point. And they are readily available by contacting your local emergency services, whether it be the police department or fire department or emergency services branch of your municipality. But very good point. Thank you. Now, during the storm, one of the things that, everybody says is, I don't want to leave my home. Well, unfortunately, mandatory evacuation, when it's called for, means mandatory. And what will typically happen in a building when a mandatory evacuation is ordered is that services will basically cease in the building. And for instance, we will turn off certain mechanical systems, air conditioning systems, elevators will be out of service and parked in the building somewhere in the shaft, depending upon your elevator company instructions. And because none of these can operate during the hurricane. And people always say, well, why can't we run the air conditioning? Or why can't we run the elevators? Okay. One of the things that you have to realize with equipment is it's very weather sensitive. Okay. For instance, I'll take the two things that I just mentioned. Elevator motor rooms are typically on the roof of the building, and during a hurricane are subject to intense weather infiltration and potential wind damage and potential shocks because of water hitting electrical components, which could travel in the shaftway and into the car. So that's why they're not run. Air conditioning, same thing. You typically will have cooling towers on a roof where you need to take those out of service prior, because what you don't want to have happen, and people don't realize that cooling towers have these big, enormous fans, which can blow off in a very heavy wind load storm and be a projectile going out and around your building. Also, one of the things, Keeley, that I would like to talk about is insurance contracts always state that it is the responsibility of the insured to properly maintain their property. So if you could talk a minute about maybe some instances or maybe some information on when a building hasn't prepared for a storm, and an insurance company will then say, well, you didn't practice good procedures in preparing, therefore there may not be coverage allowed here.
Sure. And so that's a very, very good point. And the insurance, it's the insured's responsibility to mitigate further damage after the storm. And so that means tarping, drying stuff in, making sure that the elevators aren't run, making sure that that there's no extra damage caused by neglect or by not taking action. And so that kind of dovetails into having good photos before the storm that proves what the conditions of the roofs and the elevators and all that were, and then photo documents immediately after showing, hey, here was the elevator blown off, here was the roof damaged, here's the roof tarps that went on, and try to keep as best you can a chronological order, of what the steps you're doing to mitigate that damage. And so lots of people wonder, well, am I going to get paid? Am I going to get reimbursed for that? And all that. And what we've seen is we've never seen a responsible action after the storm to mitigate further damage not be covered, assuming that there was insurance coverage at all. And so with that, anything you can do, save your receipts. I think Jordan alluded to it. Make sure the guys you hire have license. Make sure that you're hiring guys that are there, that are, from Florida, from around, have a national presence, that sort of thing. And really part of that preparation and is you're calling the guys that have spent time on the property prior to the loss, and not people that you're trying to make connections with because of the loss. And normally we've seen a lot of those. Look, there's a lot of great companies out there, but unfortunately, whenever there's a disaster, all of the guys that need deposits and need money up front and all that have plenty of time to mobilize, just like the legitimate operations have time to mobilize. So protect yourselves and who you hire. And probably the best way to do that is to have some relationship in place prior to the storm.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and going back a little to during the storm, one of the things that residents have to realize, and you really have to inform your residents who choose to stay and ride out the storm, so to speak, whether there's a mandatory evacuation in order or place or not. One of the things that during a hurricane or a tropical storm, the big thing is first responders. Okay, a lot of our buildings in South Florida are on the coastline, which have to be gone through by bridges or other means to access them if they're on, an island, so to speak. One of the things is that there is a time where first responders, if winds get above a certain amount, anywhere from it's usually 35 to 45 miles per hour, they won't come out. Okay, they won't be able to get to your building to respond, especially if the access to your building, let's say the local bridge that you take is out of service or something, or they've blocked it because of a mandatory evacuation. So we always urge residents, even if it's, not mandatory, but there is a definite potential for even a Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, even a tropical storm. You really want to urge residents to not be in the building because of the potential damage. And again, one of the things is your building's functions, as I mentioned before, will be on very limited service, if at all. And also, one of the things that will happen too is your building staff. If it's a mandatory evacuation order, your management company will most probably remove your staff from the building because we have to think about their safety as well. So anytime that you're facing a hurricane or even a major tropical storm, it is always advisable for residents to find something away from the storm. And particularly if you have a building with an elderly population, that to, really talk to them about going someplace else for the duration. One of the things too, in so I want to go back a moment to prepping your association, is one of the things is to keep a listing of those residents that may be handicapped or maybe having problem in movement or getting out of their unit, things like that, to have that information available for first responders, keeping it at the front desk in hard copy as well, so that if you need to identify people that should be looked in at or done a wellness check or something, even after the storm, is always a good process and procedure to have as well. So let's go into, unfortunately, after the storm, okay? Where the storm has hit your property, there's services out, there's all sorts of debris around. And I think one of the things that Jordan said, which is apropos, is to make those relationships with your vendors. Okay, particularly your roofing company, as Jordan mentioned, and we'll go into that in a second, but also your restoration company. Okay, a lot of restoration companies will have preferred agreements that you can sign. Typically, it doesn't cost anything. It just puts you on their preferred list for post-storm recovery services. One of the things also that you have to make a good relationship with and have a plan is with your landscaper. There's going to be a lot of damage to your landscaping, trees down, uprooted, different things area that maybe things are going to be obliged and covering access to the building. So you want to make sure that you and your landscaper have a good post-recovery plan when they can show up at the building, because don't forget, in a mandatory evacuation order, okay, as we said before, into the building's area to get into it may be definitely curtailed for a few days, if not more. So, and Keeley brought up the point of getting those passes for your residents and staff, but you may not be allowed back in the building. And one of the things too, in other words, during the post-storm recovery that you have to be very attuned to is communication to your residents. Okay. A lot of our buildings, and we recommend this to all buildings, that they have a resident portal that can be accessed through the internet, so that someone who did leave the property, you can get information to them by the resident portal, because it can be operated away from the building, and it can be, messages can be put out remotely. A lot of the systems allow for phone messages to be of emergency broadcasts, because one of the things that you want to tell your residents is don't come back to the building until we say it's safe to come back to the building. Okay. Because number one, they may not gain access to the building. And number two, unfortunately, it can hamper the recovery efforts. So in case of a mandatory evacuation or a large storm that causes a lot of damage, you want to be in constant contact through the internet, through the websites, about telling residents, giving them updates, where the elevators are not working, but we're working on it. Please stay away from the building until further notice. We will notify you when things are up and running. There's no water right now, no air conditioning, things like that. So it's very important that you basically take those into account and notify your residents as well. So let's go to Jordan first. Your client calls you, it's after a storm. We need you to come by. We don't know if there's any damage to the roof. We've not been able to get up there just because we've been dealing with so much other stuff below the roof. What is your protocol? What do you do when you get there? And what information will you be giving your clients?
So once we get on site, and whatever information that we can get from the building will help speed up that process, right? So one thing that we always like to request is any documentation of any issues, a list of potential units that potentially are having leaks, anything like that. We always tell people document, because once we get on site, having a clear understanding of any of the affected areas will help us move forward in determining what the issues are that are up on the roof, and making sure that you correspond with us as soon as possible. You want to make sure you reach out to us so that we can get you on our queue and get on site. Depending on what has occurred at the property, typically we'd like to send out a forensic roof specialist to document any of the damage on the interior, and then get up on the roof and make a full comprehensive report of what is going on up there. Based on either the severity or the complexity of the repairs, at that point we'll determine if it's something that we're going to temp in, but we would prefer always to come out and fix it the first time and make sure that we can get it right for you.
Okay. What is the protocol if, in terms of temporary protection that you will do after a storm if you can't get, say, there's trouble getting into the building, but you can get a crew up there? Do you do such things as tarping or do other protection in the meantime?
Typically, in certain instances, like for hurricanes and high wind events, we will attempt to always make or get the building as watertight as possible, whether that be through tarping if required. We can do that, but just as much time as it takes for us to get out there with a tarp, we might be able to provide other solutions that can actually keep the building watertight and have a little bit more resistance to any additional rain or wind that could be occurring after that. So typically we like to get out there and make a repair as sturdy as possible if we can't, in fact, do the full repair in total.
Great. Thank you. Keeley, from your end, please describe your post-storm activities.
So I think similar to Jordan, our goal is to get the building dried in, and while the roofers are taking care of the roof and that sort of thing, we're trying to take care of doors and windows that may be broken out, that needed to be boarded up, be able to limit access to unauthorized people to the building, fence off any buildings that may have damage that could cause building to collapse or where it's unsafe for somebody to even enter the building, until engineers and that sort of thing can get out to be able to review the conditions of the building, check the offices, the common areas, the pools, make sure that the property is secure as possible from any further damage, and then start taking photos and make sure we have all the documentation of the immediate condition of the property following the storm.
Mm-hmm. One of the things
I'd like to just mention real quick as far as the documentation and why it's so important to have an established relationship with a roofing company is post-storm. Let's say, the roof is at a point where it might not be serviceable or it is completely damaged. If you have a relationship with a company and potentially the company that actually put the roof on, we're going to have all the documents, the permitting, all that information that might be required for your insurance as well. So once again, it's just imperative to be proactive rather than reactive, and have a company that has some of that documentation for you offsite in case that might have been damaged, lost, or misplaced, during the fervor of a storm.
Very, very good point. And Keeley, the point you made is very apropos in terms of checking all your systems at a building. Because one of the things that we mentioned before is you're going to be, for the most part, depending upon the size of the hurricane and mandatory or non-mandatory evacuations, is, for instance, one of the things is the elevators. One of the things that we recommend to our associations is, as a post-storm recovery, you don't want to run those elevators until they're checked out by your elevator service company, because you don't know if there was any damage to anything up on the roof for either wind or moisture, rain, that type of thing. You don't want to start up these elevators before they've been checked out by your elevator company. So that's one of the things that you also have to tell your residents. The minute the storm ends, the building is not back to normal yet. It does take time to get everything set up and back to operating stance. Keeley, one of the things that I'd like to ask you is, basically, what are the environmental issues that can be raised in a building or an association because of a hurricane?
So certainly before anybody can start on demo or anything within the property, an asbestos survey has to be done of the property. And it doesn't matter if the property was built last week or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's a law in every state that we know of, that an asbestos survey needs to be done to make sure that the workers are not put into some kind of danger with working with hazardous building materials. Also, elevators and all of those all have oil transformers. Some older transformers have oils that we need to make sure they're not spilled or not running out into the parking lot, into the storm drains and that sort of thing. Trying to make sure that is if there are any other oils and that sort of thing, that those are contained and that can't do any further environmental harm. And then after that is the moisture mapping group comes in and they try to document, unit by unit, floor by floor, documenting any water intrusion, any sheetrock, any wet building material, carpet, ceilings, walls that will in the future need to be demoed once a full plan is put in place. But the sooner you can start checking on those things, the better.
I think you bring up a good point, particularly about the moisture. Is that, basically with associations, as you said, whether they were built 50 years ago or whether they were built a year ago and they opened a year ago, one of the things that it's a very good idea to, as the post-storm recovery, is to really make a survey of every apartment in the building. Because don't forget, a lot of buildings here has a majority or a good amount of transitory residents who have not come back, who've closed their apartments up for the season. We recommend that, if you are one of those, not a permanent resident, that you employ a caretaker who can come to your apartment locally after the storm to look and see. But we also recommend that your building staff make an assessment of every apartment post-storm recovery to see if there are any damage or any water infiltration, because as Keeley said, one of the things that could happen is that can turn into a whole environmental issue with mold. And if an apartment, has been vacant for some time, typically they will leave the air conditioner off, which is another thing that, or the air conditioner was off because it was turned off because of mandatory evacuation order. So it's very important that you do an apartment by apartment survey post-storm to see if there are any issues. One of the other things that you're also going to want to look at is any sort of structural damage. I think Jordan said it best, and Keeley, is to have a structural condition study made post-storm. Okay, particularly if it's a very bad storm, a Cat 2, 3, 4, on Cat 5, but you want to get a structural assessment of your building, particularly if you've noticed some damage. So that's very important. And again, if there is damage, if you see damage that could be structural, you want to have that structural study done or inspection done before, obviously, you allow residents back into the building. So it's very attuned, of course, after Surfside, but even before Surfside, anything unnoticeable that wasn't there before in terms of structural, whether it's a crack, whether you see something that's like a railing is separated from the building or hanging off, that you want to make a particular call to your engineer and get them out there to assess the condition, and something that has to be done immediately before someone can either occupy that unit, that area, or the entire building itself. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to some questions from the attendees. I see we have one. Keeley, could you talk about, a lot of associations, and this person is asking, do we need to hire public adjusters?
So I think the public adjusters certainly serve as a representative for the policyholder to ensure that that every aspect that the customer, the owner of the insurance policy gets every benefit of the insurance policies that are in place. And typically they come in once the first offer has been made by the insurance company, and it's clearly $1 million worth of damage, and they've offered $100,000 or $200,000 or something to work out the problems with the policy. And so public adjusters can be a huge help, and are brought in at a time when the insured feels like they are not getting the benefits of every bit of their policy, and that's the typical role of a public adjuster.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for you, Jordan. Our building is thinking of putting on a new roof. Are there any roofing systems that are more hurricane resistant than others?
Yes, there are. The roof system that has the highest uplift rating is actually one that I would not recommend for South Florida at all. And that is a spray foam roof system. So it actually has the highest uplift rating, yet should never be installed when the humidity is above 60%. So you could imagine that almost leaves very few days for the application. They also require more maintenance than most roof systems. It's not something that I would recommend depending really for any building here in South Florida. Now, depending on the type of building you have, like I said, it would first start with us coming out to do an inspection, determine what the deck is, what the building is used for, and then we can provide you with multiple options for your building. And then there are always options for enhancing it beyond what the engineering is requesting. And we can do that as well, if that's something they're looking to do.
Okay. I also have a question, which is actually one I've asked in the past. Is there all these little rocks on our roof? Why are they there? Because they blow off and damage our cars during a hurricane. If you could just explain why they're there, and are there systems that don't require those?
Absolutely. So that to me is typically like a built-up tar or a tar and gravel roof system with the gravel that is on top. That is more of an antiquated roofing system. We don't typically install, you don't see new roof systems like that being installed much anymore. There are more efficient and more cost-effective roof systems now that are on the market, that are taking up a much larger market share. But what that was done is during an earlier phase of engineering, those rocks were actually in place to kind of help with the drainage, but also keep some of that water on the roof, which would actually help cool the building from an efficiency standpoint. What we've found since then is, and as roofing has kind of progressed, is we want to get that water off the building now as quickly as possible. So we've gone away from those roof systems. Also, the codes and drainage requirements have changed ever since Andrew. So typically when I'm seeing those roofs, they are older roof systems, and those are roof systems we're either repairing or completely removing and replacing with a different and more efficient roof system.
Great, thank you. Keeley, a question for you. During the last hurricane, our claim took years to run out and to finally be finalized. Why does it take so long? And is there anything an association can do to shorten the process?
So I think that's we hear that a lot, and we've got a few that we're part of that have taken years to resolve, and part of it is, it's a couple of parts and pieces to that. The adjuster and the desk adjuster and the building consultant all combine to decide what gets paid and how much on that claim. And if you have a group that is more difficult to deal with, then that is what drags the claim on. We've seen in Hurricane Ian, American Coastal is a big insurance provider down there, and they're having a little bit of trouble financially, and so those claims are going to take a while to settle, because their whole business model, it's part of that company's business model to continue selling policies and continue collecting premium to pay for the storm that just happened. Frontline is another one we're having lots of trouble with, that they are just denying lots of claims and not paying much and that sort of thing. And so kind of back to that public adjuster, when you get a group that is either having trouble financially or the desk adjuster, reach impasses and that sort of thing, then that's when a lot of different things can be done. And what we can, all the policies have the right to invoke appraisal. And the sooner you do that, sooner you realize you're at an impasse, evoking your right to appraisal gets it's the final ruling of the insurance company hires an appraiser, the association would hire an appraiser, and those two agree on a third. And so it's a three-part system, and those are the ones that seem to take quite a bit of time. But unfortunately, there's just so many factors that factor into that there's no one reason why that happens. The one thing that you can do, again, part of that pre-planning is to get an adjuster and a building consultant assigned to your policy. So no different than your contractor that you're working with. Some of the larger associations, the insurance company is not going to do it for a 10 unit or 15 unit or 20 unit condominium project, but for a 100 unit, for a 200 unit condominium project, they absolutely, you can work with your agent to get a building consultant, which I would argue is as important, if not more important than the adjuster. But both of those people can be assigned to your policy. And then that way, who you're working with, again, at the time of the loss. If you've got the contractor on call, you've got the building consultant, and you know who your adjuster is, well, then you've just kind of solved three of your biggest problems: getting the claim resolved, getting the money you need to pay to put the building back together, and being able to use the condominium or be able to get it back in the rental pool or however the condo is used. But those are kind of the three parts that you need prior to the storm.
You mentioned there are a couple of carriers that you find you have problems with. Are there any ones out there that are better or that are more attuned to paying claims or adjudicating a loss quicker and better?
It's a good question, and we're all wondering the same thing. AmCoastal is one that nobody ever really thought would have problems. But if you look at AmCoastal, who does Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, they've had a terrible 5 or 6 year run here, and so the same thing with Frontline. So I think it's cyclical a little bit, and other carriers, as Frontline now pulls out and AmCoastal pulls out, well, then Citizens and some of these others will come in. But it's really to work with your broker at the time of, everybody's so focused on what the dollar amount of the policy is, especially now with rates doubling and tripling, and they're not looking at who that carrier is that's quoting, and the AA rated, that still the rating agencies. If you could just ask a few of those questions to your to your broker when you're renewing those policies. What's the rating on the insurance company, and then how many insurance companies are participating in your policy? Again, some of the larger associations, 30, 40, 50, $60 million and up in insurable value, you may have 4 or 5 companies that participate in your policy, and just getting a little background on them is of value, even though it doesn't seem like it at the time when you're writing a check for the policy.
You bring up a very good point, because a lot of buildings now, unfortunately, because of the association marketplace with insurance, are going to what we refer to as laddered coverage, where, if you have as Keeley just said, if you have a $60 million property limit, there'll be one at 10 million, another at 10, one at 5. So you could have a number of carriers that may come into play, because in a major hurricane, losses can be substantial and reach into the millions of dollars. So very, very good point. Jordan, I have a question for you. A technical one put out by one of the participants. Is coating a modified bitumen roof an effective approach to extend the life of a roof in a hurricane area?
I think that there is a little bit of a misnomer in the market where coatings are being marketed as a new roof system, and it is certainly not that. There are certain requirements that a lot of companies seem to want to circumvent to properly vet and make sure that a coating is even an applicable system. Now, typically a 10-year manufacturer warranty system is only going to add about 22 millimeters of a dry film thickness on top of your roof. Now, the most important part when considering, reinforcing the roof and the lifespan of your roof is how well it is attached to the deck, because most often a roof is going to be sucked off at the corner or the perimeter by the negative pressure that is blowing on top of the building and against the building and coming up over the sides. So adding a coating to the roof system at the correct time can help prolong the roof, but it is not going to add any uplift value to the existing system. It's not going to stop a roof system from becoming compromised during a high wind event. That's why it's so important for us to be inspecting and maintaining these roof systems prior to to hurricane season, because we want to make you and the buildings aware of any areas that are potentially compromised so that they can be repaired, or we can talk about potentially a re-roof prior to the hurricane season to make sure that roof system is properly attached to the deck, to make sure that you don't have that happen.
And I also think there's code that limits the amount of roofing systems or coatings that can be on a roof.
Correct. So you can only have up to 2 roof systems on any structure. And also there are requirements for a coating where you would have to get a moisture survey performed to actually determine if the moisture is below the allowable threshold, which currently is 25% of the roof. If over 25% of that roof is above the allowable threshold, coating is no longer an option. And really at that point, we should be discussing the possibilities of a replacement, because once moisture has entered the roof system, it will start to delaminate the roof from the deck. That is where that uplift is so important, to make sure that the roof is properly attached, because that would most likely be one of the first locations where the roof will fail. And if it can take a corner, it could potentially take the whole roof with it as well.
All right, good, very, very good point. Yeah, people don't realize that, a roof reacts in a hurricane sort of like a piece of fruit, in the sense as it peels off. And the minute the wind catches that one loose area, and as you say, most of it are in corners or perimeter, it just goes peel the entire roof off that building.
Absolutely. And, whenever you've seen videos of roofs going, it's always the corner, the perimeter. Typically, when we're installing a roof, there are perimeter enhancements and there are requirements, per code that require us to reinforce or add additional fasteners, things of that nature, along the perimeter and in the corners, because they know that to be such a common occurrence.
Right, exactly. I think it's a very good point. So, if you're contemplating a new roof, that's something you want to look for and you want to ask for when you discuss with your potential bidders, is how are they addressing the vulnerable areas of a roof, that may be affected during a hurricane. And as Jordan said, there are some extra fastening, there are some extra methodology that can be used on that. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I think you was some very good takeoffs from this. And I think one of the things, just to reiterate, is basically it's all in the preparation. Hurricanes are horrible, they're destructive, they're life-threatening, but an association can mitigate that with preparation. Anything from having a protocol for your residents to having inspections done of your building, taking care of issues on your building when they occur, not doing deferred maintenance on key points that will be affected by a hurricane, and basically making sure that you communicate with your residents before, during, and after is so important. For anybody that would like to get a hold of Keeley or Jordan, their information is on the screen. as well as mine for any additional information you would like about hurricane preparedness. But gentlemen, thank you so much. Is there any closing points that you would like to make before we leave the webinar?
Sure. It's just really reiterating what you've really just kind of summarized, Doug. And it's, have a plan, make sure that you have a relationship, and being proactive can help mitigate so many issues down the road, and it can expedite the process even after the fact. So just have a plan and make sure that you guys are in contact with, not only a roofing vendor, but plumbers and electricians. Just make sure you have a list of reliable vendors that you can reach out to, so that we can help solve your problems as quickly as possible and get you back to the lifestyle you're used to.
Great. Great.
Yeah, so the same thing. So I think, let us, we're used to this. We do it all the time. We're used to the challenges of working in areas with no electricity and power lines down and that sort of thing. So lean on us to try to help with those things that seem like are overwhelming. A lot of times we've been in similar situations and have guys and girls that have the experience dealing with the aftermath and are it can be a resource for anything you need.
Great. Thank you again, both Jordan and Keeley. Thank you to our participants. We're going to hope that the information that we've given you today is not needed. But again, we're looking for a busy hurricane season this year. And again, please make sure that by now you've done all your prep work, because we have seen, unfortunately, early season storms. But again, thank you for attending. We look forward to our next webinar for additional information on association operations. Thank you for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day.